The Ghost Train to New Orleans was good. In some ways it was better than the first book, but it lost so many points by just being a sequel and not being part of a whole series. Have I been obsessing over this for 2 months? No, I've been obsessing over this for way longer, and now you all have to suffer with me. Let's talk about the second book in the Shambling Guides Series, The Ghost Train to New Orleans by Mur Lafferty.
Ghosts.
The Ghost Train to New Orleans picks up just a few weeks after the ending of the first book, with Zoe and her co-workers getting ready to head to New Orleans to research their next travel guide. The book starts with Zoe hiring a Norse goddess, Ire, then heading over to her boyfriend Arthur's house to say goodbye before her trip. But while she's there, the B-plot gets set up when Arthur realizes he can't find the herbs that he's been taking to keep himself from becoming a zombie after he was bit in the first book. When he realizes his sister took them and threw them away, he decides to go to New Orleans with Zoe and her crew to hopefully find the witch doctor who's been sending the herbs to Ben, the zoetist who's been treating Arthur.
I need a doctor.
So that night, the crew heads to the ghost train that goes up and down the East Coast, and right away things get weird. Zoe meets Bernard, who immediately puts her on edge and ends up giving her misinformation on ghosts. Then, not long after, the train is attacked by ghosts, who end up shooting Zoe and injuring a zoetist girl who was traveling in the same car. But the ghosts leave soon after, and lucky for Zoe, Ire is a healing goddess, so she walks away from the gunshot relatively fine. And then Gwen, a death goddess, introduces Zoe to Anna, a real ghost, and they help explain how ghosts really work. And while all of this is happening, Arthur's asleep because he thought it would be a good idea to take sleeping medicine, which is just the first of many decisions Arthur makes that annoys me. We also learn on the train that Zoe's adopted, a plot point that was not brought up in the first book, and is lightly touched upon through this book, but it doesn't affect the plot in any meaningful way. But it does help explain how Zoe is a magical human, a city talker, and how she went her whole life without knowing it. But I will talk about that more later.
I'm adopted?
Then, finally, they arrive in New Orleans, and there is no rest for the wicked, because as soon as they arrive, things get wild. First, while Zoe is walking around the city, getting a feel for it, she meets a god who invites her to a carnival celebration that will happen a few nights later. Then their first night in the city, Zoe, Gwen, and Ire all go to a zoetist meeting that's happening in preparation for the upcoming holiday, Life Day. And while they're there, Zoe and Gwen get in a fight that ends with Zoe stumbling around drunk with Bernard, who keeps popping up. Then when Zoe gets back to her hotel, she discovers that Kevin, one of the vampires who's with her, quit, and now he started a killing spree. So Zoe, Birdie the dragon, and Opal, who's the vampire who turned Kevin, all have to go out and stop him. And after a nasty fight, they end up killing him. And once again, Zoe gets pretty beat up, and Ire heals her.
I need a doctor.
Then the next day, Zoe goes wandering around the city again, this time somewhat guided by Anna, who tracks Zoe down at the zoetist dinner, because when she was alive, she was also a city talker, and she helped Zoe connect with New Orleans. Together, they go to the heart of the city, where Zoe makes a point to connect to the city by essentially disconnecting with her body, so she can interact with the soul of the city. And this helps unlock a bunch of new skills for Zoe and helps her learn about the history of magical humans and why she was likely given up for adoption, since not long before her birth, there was a genocide on magical humans by other coterie. But after Zoe learns this and tries to reconnect with her body, she realizes she can't, and New Orleans doesn't want to help her. So Zoe ends up projecting her spirit all over the city, talking to other ghosts, asking Gwen for help, and then finally running into a witch doctor who helps her reconnect with her physical body.
The body's gone! Huh?
And Zoe ends up reconnecting just in time to head to the carnival party, and while they're there, they meet up with Bernard, who Zoe now suspects works for a shadow organization of assassins known as the Grey Cabal, and Arthur pops up for the first time since they got off the train. And while they're together, Zoe and Arthur break up. Then Arthur storms out to head to the swamps to look for the witch doctor who has his herbs, and Zoe decides to follow him. Gwen and Ire head with Arthur, and Zoe ends up heading into the swamps with Opal and Birdie. And basically right after they arrive there, they get into trouble since they're ambushed, and Zoe ends up getting kidnapped by the witch doctor. For the life of me, I can't remember her name, who wants Zoe for her blood. This is where we get another revelation about magical humans, that their blood holds power, and this witch doctor is getting her power by draining it from other magical humans she's captured.
Whoa, it's a trap!
Luckily, before the witch doctor can drain Zoe dry, Anna shows up again and manages to possess one of the unrestrained victims, and they help free Zoe. Then after that, a fight breaks out since Arthur, Gwen, and Ire have shown up for the herbs, and Bernard shows up with Public Works since they know what the witch doctor has been doing and are trying to stop her. After that, a fight breaks out where Zoe realizes she can control other Zoetis golems with her blood, and she gives Bernard the opportunity to kill the witch doctor, which has the unfortunate side effect of dooming Arthur, who decides he'd much rather have Opal turn him into a vampire than become a zombie.
A vampire.
Then after that, things wrap up, and Zoe and her crew get ready to head back to New York after they've gotten everything they need to write their next travel book. For the most part, this was a really solid sequel. I think Mur Lafferty came into the series knowing it would be multiple books, because she left each book in a fairly nice bow, but with hints that Zoe was ready to go on another adventure. The first book ended with Zoe telling Arthur about the next travel book in New Orleans, and this book ended with Zoe wanting to head to England to find out about the Grey Cabal, which made the lack of more books that much more frustrating.
We had a plan! We had a plan!
But if you want to know how to write a good sequel, this book is a good example. Sequels can be hard because you either have to undo some plot points that were all wrapped up with the first book, or come up with something new that still makes sense to happen in the world you established. And you have to continue with character arcs that may have felt like they were wrapped up in the first story. And if you do that wrong, it may make the characters feel like they forgot all the progress they originally made. But the character growth that's happening in this book feels very natural. Zoe is learning about herself, and this book shows that what she learned was just the tip of the iceberg. The fact that Zoe was adopted feels a little shoehorned in there, but not too much, since Zoe doesn't talk much about her family in the first book. So there's a lot for us to learn there that feels like it's just expanding on what was originally a blink and you'll miss it moment in the first book.
Both of my parents failed to show up.
And this book sets up that room to expand on the world and the characters and their backstories even more, which is frustrating because there's no follow-up. This would work so well if there were another book to tie together all the plot points that were just left loose at the end of this book. It's a flaw that comes with writing a story knowing you want it to be part of something bigger. If that bigger doesn't come together, it leaves what you did put out feeling incomplete. And another thing I really liked with this story is the characters. The world building was a lot more expansive, and we got to spend more time with a lot more side characters, which helped make the world feel that much more real and immersive. Plus, this book only had one succubus who Zoe barely interacted with, so that helped avoid the plot points that were really icky from the first book. And the rest of the characters were really fun. I talked in my last video about how these are popcorn books. I read them for fun, not sustenance. And the characters were so fun. They were snarky and sassy and weren't afraid to call each other jerks, which was really fun to read. The only characterization that really frustrated me was Arthur and Bernard.
What happened to boys will be boys?
Bernard is a fine character, but it's obvious he was introduced to help make a love triangle between Zoe, Bernard, and Arthur, which is such a tired trope. It's not one I can get into, and unfortunately we're not given enough from this book to know if it would have been the rare, good love triangle. And then adding to that, Arthur was so frustrating in this book. Alright, so they established that a rule with ghosts is that they can only possess people who willingly let themselves be possessed or are asleep. And who was drugged and asleep in a very out-of-character way in the book? Arthur. I thought they were setting it up for him to have been possessed on the train, but that was just another plot point that was left dangling. And it was also frustrating watching Arthur be cold and push Zoe away. It's pretty typical YA romance tropes, which, as I said in my last review video, is a frustrating trope anyway, but especially when the characters aren't young adults. These are characters in their 30s. They feel a little too old to be acting this way.
I'm old, so I'm the victim.
But I will say, Zoe is a fun character. She's one who I wanted to follow through more books, and I could go on and on bemoaning the fact that there weren't more books, but I'd end up just running around in circles, so I'll wrap up the video and complain to my cat instead. Overall, if you like the Shambling Guide to New York, you'll love this book. It's fun, so go read The Ghost Train to New Orleans.